In the heart of London stands a fortress that has witnessed 1,000 years of secrets, betrayals, and blood. The Tower of London, where queens have lost their heads, where traitors have met their end, and where two innocent children simply vanished. It was the summer of 1483. Two royal brothers, aged just 12 and 9, entered the Tower of London as kings and princes. They were never seen alive again. This is the story of the princes in the Tower, England's greatest unsolved murder, a mystery that has haunted historians for over 5 centuries. Tonight we descend into the darkness of medieval conspiracy, royal ambition, and cold-blooded murder. Welcome back to Dark Ages Chronicles. I'm your guide through the shadows of history. To understand this dark tale, we must first step into the blood-soaked world of 15th century England. The year is 1483, and the realm bleeds from 30 years of civil war, the Wars of the Roses. For 3 decades, 2 branches of the royal family, the House of York, symbolized by the white rose, and the House of Lancaster, bearing the red, have torn England apart in their struggle for the crown. Battles have raged from Towton to Bosworth, leaving thousands dead and the nobility decimated. But by 1483, it seemed the bloodshed might finally end. King Edward IV of York had ruled for over 20 years, bringing relative peace and prosperity. He had secured the throne, married for love rather than politics, and produced 2 healthy sons to continue his line. Edward IV was a giant of a man, 6'4", charismatic, and utterly devoted to pleasure. He loved wine, women, and warfare in equal measure. But beneath the revelry of his court, dark currents swirled. The king had made enemies. His marriage to Elizabeth Woodville, a commoner and widow, had scandalized the nobility. Her family, the Woodvilles, were seen as grasping upstarts, enriching themselves at the expense of the ancient aristocracy. And then there was Edward's brother, Richard, Duke of Gloucester, loyal, capable, but forever in his brother's shadow. Richard had never married for love as Edward had. He had never enjoyed the easy charm that made Edward beloved. But he had something perhaps more valuable in those dark times. He had survived. On April 9th, 1483, everything changed. King Edward IV, at just 40 years old, suddenly fell ill and died. The great king was dead, and his heir was just a 12-year-old boy. The vultures began to circle. Young Edward V was at Ludlow Castle on the Welsh border when word came of his father's death. At 12 years old, he was now King of England, but a child king in a realm where weakness had meant death. The boy king began his journey toward London for his coronation, accompanied by his maternal uncle, Earl Rivers, and his half-brother, Sir Richard Grey, both Woodvilles. But they would never reach the capital. At Stony Stratford, a small market town north of London, their party was met by 2 men, Henry Stafford, Duke of Buckingham, and Richard, Duke of Gloucester, the boy's paternal uncle and protector of the realm. What happened next would echo through history as one of the most calculated political moves ever executed. Richard and Buckingham arrived with a substantial armed escort. They greeted the young king warmly, showing every sign of loyalty and respect. But their true target wasn't the boy. It was his Woodville guardians. That very night, Earl Rivers and Richard Grey were arrested on charges of treason. The official accusation: they were plotting to exclude Richard from his rightful role as proactor and seize control of the government themselves. Rivers and Grey were hauled away in chains, leaving young Edward V alone with his uncle Richard. The boy king, confused and frightened, had little choice but to continue toward London under Richard's protection. When they reached the capital on May 4th, 1483, the procession was a masterpiece of political theater. Richard rode humbly behind his nephew, playing the role of loyal protector to perfection. The crowds cheered for their boy king, unaware that they were witnessing the opening act of a tragedy. But instead of taking Edward to one of the royal palaces, Richard escorted him to the Tower of London. Now, this wasn't unusual. The Tower served as a royal residence, and kings traditionally stayed there before their coronations. But something about this felt different. The tower's massive walls closed around the 12-year-old king like a trap, and once inside, young Edward V would discover that leaving would be far more difficult than entering. Days turned into weeks. Edward's coronation, scheduled for June 22nd, was postponed indefinitely. Officially, Richard was merely ensuring the boy's safety while preparing for the ceremony. But whispers began to spread through London's streets. Where was the king? Why was he hidden away in the tower? And why did Richard seem in no hurry to crown his nephew? The answer would soon become terrifyingly clear. Richard, Duke of Gloucester, was 30 years old in 1483, a seasoned politician and warrior who had survived the deadly game of medieval politics longer than most. But survival wasn't enough anymore. He wanted more. History has painted Richard as a monster, Shakespeare's bottled spider, a hunchback villain who murdered his way to the throne. But the real Richard was far more complex and perhaps far more dangerous. Richard had proved his loyalty to his brother Edward IV countless times. He had commanded armies, governed the turbulent north of England with an iron fist, and never once rebelled against the crown. He was competent, ruthless, and utterly pragmatic. But now, with Edward IV dead and a child on the throne, Richard faced a terrible choice. He could step back and allow the Woodvilles to dominate the young king's government, probably ensuring his own political destruction. Or he could seize power himself. The decision came down to a simple calculation: them or him. In late June 1483, Richard made his move. He called a meeting of the Royal Council at the Tower of London. The most powerful men in England gathered in the council chamber, expecting to discuss arrangements for Edward V's coronation. Instead, they witnessed one of the most audacious political coups in English history. Richard burst into the chamber, his arm withered and twisted, allegedly by sorcery. He accused Queen Elizabeth Woodville and her allies of using witchcraft against him. Then, in a display of pure theater, he rolled up his sleeve to show his deformed arm as proof of their magical attacks. It was brilliant political propaganda. In an age where people genuinely feared witchcraft, Richard's accusation cast the Woodvilles as enemies of God and nature itself. Lord Hastings, Edward IV's closest friend and a man who might have opposed Richard's plans, was dragged from the chamber and executed on the spot. Others were arrested. The message was clear: submit to Richard or die. But Richard's masterstroke was yet to come. On June 22nd, the very day Edward V should have been crowned, a theologian named Ralph Shaw delivered a sermon at Paul's Cross in London. Shaw's message was explosive. Edward IV's marriage to Elizabeth Woodville had been invalid. The king had already been betrothed to another woman when he wed Elizabeth, making their union unlawful in the eyes of God and their children bastards. If Edward V and his brother Richard were illegitimate, then they had no claim to the throne. And if that were true, then Richard, Duke of Gloucester, was the rightful king of England. Parliament, packed with Richard's supporters, agreed. On July 6, 1483, Richard was crowned King Richard III. The boy who should have been Edward V was declared a bastard, stripped of his crown, and left with only one companion in the tower: his 9-year-old brother, Richard, Duke of York. Two young princes, now officially nobody, locked in the Tower of London with their uncle, now their king, holding the only key. But here's where our story takes its darkest turn, and I want you to consider this carefully. Was Richard III's claim to the throne legitimate? The evidence for Edward IV's pre-contract does exist, but it's suspiciously convenient. What do you think? Was Richard protecting the realm from bastard kings? Or was he simply a ruthless usurper who would say anything to steal a crown? Let me know in the comments, but keep watching because the mystery is just beginning. Summer 1483. The Tower of London had become a prison for two young boys who, just months before, had been among the most important children in Europe. Edward, the deposed king, was 12, old enough to understand that his world had collapsed. His brother Richard, Duke of York, was only 9, still young enough to find adventure in their new surroundings. But for both boys, the tower's walls grew higher and more menacing with each passing day. Contemporary accounts tell us that the princes were initially seen playing in the tower gardens, shooting arrows, and being attended by their servants. To outside observers, they seemed to be treated well, still living as royalty, even if they were no longer royal. But as summer wore on, something began to change. Dr. Argentine, Edward's physician, later reported that the young former king grew increasingly melancholy. The boy spent hours in prayer, convinced that death was approaching. He made his confession daily, as if preparing his soul for the end. The prince's appearances in the tower gardens became less frequent. Their attendants were gradually dismissed and replaced with Richard III's men. The boys' movements became more restricted, their quarters more closely guarded. And then, sometime in late August or early September 1483, they simply disappeared. No fanfare, no announcement, no explanation. The two most watched prisoners in England vanished as if they had never existed at all. The last recorded sighting of the princes came from the tower's constable, who reported seeing them at a window in the Bloody Tower in late August. They appeared to be standing together, two small figures silhouetted against the stone walls that had become their world. After that, nothing. Richard III's government offered no explanation for the prince's disappearance. No death announcements, no funeral arrangements, no official word of any kind. It was as if the boys had simply ceased to exist. But silence bred rumors, and rumors spread like plague through London's streets. Some said the princes had been murdered in their sleep. Others claimed they had been poisoned. The most gruesome tales spoke of suffocation, of young lives snuffed out like candles in the darkness. One particularly horrific account, which wouldn't emerge until decades later, described the princes being smothered with their own pillows, their small bodies carried down the tower's stone steps and buried somewhere in its depths. Whether true or not, these stories captured the imagination of a kingdom that had grown accustomed to royal blood being spilled for political gain. But here's what makes this mystery so enduring. Richard III, despite having every political reason to announce the princes' deaths if they had died naturally, said absolutely nothing. His silence spoke volumes, and it would ultimately cost him everything. Within 2 years, Henry Tudor would land in England, claiming the throne and painting Richard III as a child murderer. At the Battle of Bosworth Field in 1485, Richard would die fighting, and with his death, the truth about the princes seemed to die as well. But the mystery was far from over. Because if Richard III didn't murder the princes, and some historians argue he didn't, then who did? For over 500 years, historians, writers, and amateur sleuths have wrestled with the central question: who killed the princes in the tower? The suspects read like a medieval murder mystery, each with motive, means, and opportunity to commit one of history's most consequential crimes. The traditional villain, Richard III. The case against Richard III seems obvious. He had the most to gain from the princes' deaths. Their existence would always threaten his rule. He controlled the tower where they disappeared, and he had already shown ruthless efficiency in eliminating political rivals. Tudor propaganda, especially Shakespeare's play, cemented Richard as the archetypal child-killing monarch. But this narrative serves the victors. The Tudors needed Richard to be a monster to justify their own claim to the throne. Modern historians point out serious flaws in the case against Richard. Why would he kill the princes secretly when announcing their natural deaths would have served him better? If they were dead, why didn't he produce bodies to end speculation? And why risk the massive scandal when he had already neutralized them politically? The ambitious mother, Margaret Beaufort. But what if the real killer was someone else entirely? Enter Lady Margaret Beaufort, mother of Henry Tudor and one of the most ruthless political operators of her age. Margaret had spent decades maneuvering to place her son on the English throne. She was intelligent, connected, and utterly devoted to Henry's cause. Most importantly, she had access to the tower through her husband, Lord Stanley, who held significant influence there. Here's the theory. Margaret arranged the prince's murder to eliminate them as potential rallying points for Yorkist resistance. With the boys dead, her son Henry could claim the throne as the last viable alternative to Richard III. The timing supports this theory. The princes disappeared just as Margaret began seriously plotting Henry Tudor's invasion of England. Their deaths would have been essential to her son's success. The ambitious Duke, Buckingham's betrayal. Then there's Henry Stafford, Duke of Buckingham, Richard's ally turned enemy. Buckingham had helped Richard seize power, but quickly grew disillusioned with his rewards. Some historians suggest Buckingham murdered the princes either on Richard's orders or to frame Richard and clear his own path to the throne. Buckingham had royal blood and ambitions to match. The Duke's subsequent rebellion against Richard III in October 1483 might have been motivated by guilt, ambition, or a desperate attempt to distance himself from the murders. The survivor theory, did they escape? But what if the princes weren't murdered at all? Some historians argue they survived, hidden away by loyal servants, or spirited out of England entirely. This theory points to the various pretenders who later claimed to be one of the princes, most notably Perkin Warbeck, who insisted he was Richard, Duke of York. While most historians dismiss these claims, they kept the Tudor government nervous for years. The Tower of London, with its maze of tunnels and secret passages, could have concealed an escape. Perhaps the princes lived out their days in obscurity, their true identities known only to a few faithful protectors. The Henry Tudor connection. Finally, there's the possibility that Henry Tudor himself ordered the murders, either before or after Bosworth Field. As king, Henry VII would have had Henry's treatment of other Yorkist survivors was ruthless. He imprisoned, executed, or neutralized anyone with a claim to the throne. The princes would have been his greatest threat if they had survived to adulthood. So here's my question for you. After hearing all these theories, who do you think killed the princes in the tower? Was it the obvious suspect, Richard III, or was someone else pulling the strings? Was it Margaret Beaufort plotting for her son, the ambitious Buckingham, or did the princes somehow survive? I genuinely want to know what you think, because even after 500 years, historians can't agree. Drop your theory in the comments, but first, let's examine the physical evidence that might finally solve this mystery. In 1674, nearly 2 centuries after the princes vanished, workmen renovating the Tower of London made a grisly discovery. Buried beneath a staircase leading to the White Tower, they found a wooden box containing the skeletons of 2 children. The bones were small, delicate, and appeared to belong to children of roughly the right ages, 12 and 9 years old. King Charles II, convinced these were the remains of the murdered princes, ordered them reburied with full royal honors in Westminster Abbey. For many, this seemed to close the case. The princes had been murdered and secretly buried, just as the rumor suggested. But modern forensic science tells a more complex story. In 1933, the bones were examined by experts who concluded they probably belonged to children of the right ages and time period. However, the examination was limited by 1930s technology and the church's reluctance to allow destructive testing. Crucially, the gender of the skeletons couldn't be definitively determined, nor could the cause of death. Were these really the princes, or just 2 other unfortunate children who died in the tower over its long and bloody history? Today, DNA testing could potentially solve this mystery once and for all. The remains of Richard III, discovered in a Leicester parking lot in 2012, have provided a genetic profile that could be compared to the tower bones. But Westminster Abbey has consistently refused to allow such testing. The church's position is that the remains have already been recognized as those of the princes and should rest in peace. Critics argue this prevents the resolution of one of history's greatest mysteries. Beyond the bones, other evidence remains frustratingly ambiguous. Richard III's own records, which might have provided definitive answers, were largely destroyed or lost. The Tudor historians who succeeded him had every reason to paint him as a villain. What we do know is this: the princes disappeared, Richard III never explained what happened to them, and their disappearance helped justify Henry Tudor's successful invasion of England. The truth may have died with Richard III at Bosworth Field, taking the secret of the prince's fate to his grave beneath the hooves of Henry Tudor's cavalry. But archaeology continues to reveal new secrets. In recent years, excavations at the Tower of London have uncovered new evidence about medieval life there, including the discovery of previously unknown chambers and passages. Could these hiding places have concealed the princes? Could future discoveries finally reveal what happened in those dark summer months of 1483? So what really happened to the princes in the tower? After more than 5 centuries of investigation, speculation, and debate, the truth remains as elusive as ever. The balance of evidence suggests the princes were indeed murdered, most likely in late summer 1483. The timing of their disappearance, the political circumstances, and the subsequent behavior of all parties involved point toward a calculated assassination. But was Richard III the killer? The case against him, while compelling, isn't conclusive. He had motive and opportunity, but his behavior after their disappearance doesn't match what we might expect from a guilty man. The other suspects, Margaret Beaufort, the Duke of Buckingham, even Henry Tudor himself, all had reasons to want the princes dead. Each had access to the tower, each had political motivations, and each benefited from the boys' removal from the political equation. Perhaps the most likely scenario is that the princes were murdered on someone's orders, but the identity of that someone has been lost to history. The medieval world was one where political murder was common, where children were expendable pawns in adult games of power. Today, visitors to the Tower of London can walk through the very chambers where Edward V and Richard, Duke of York, spent their final days. The bloody tower still stands, its windows looking out over the Thames just as they did when 2 young faces last peered through them. The ravens that legend says must never leave the tower still patrol its grounds, guardians of secrets that may never be revealed. Among those secrets, none is darker or more enduring than the fate of 2 innocent children who became pawns in a deadly game they never chose to play. The prince's disappearance changed the course of English history. It ended the Plantagenet dynasty that had ruled England for over 300 years and ushered in the Tudor Age. It gave us Henry VIII, Elizabeth I, and the English Renaissance. But the price was paid by 2 children whose only crime was being born into a royal family. Their story reminds us that behind every historical turning point lie individual human tragedies. Behind every crown seized and every dynasty founded, there are often innocent victims whose names we remember long after their killers have been forgotten. The princes in the tower have become symbols of innocence destroyed by ambition, of childhood sacrificed on the altar of adult politics. Whether they died in 1483 or somehow survived, their story continues to haunt us because it represents something fundamental about power. Those who seek it are often willing to destroy anything and anyone who stands in their way. So the mystery endures. In the shadows of the Tower of London, 2 small ghosts may still walk the ancient stones, forever seeking the justice that history has never been able to provide. The truth about the princes in the tower may be lost forever, but their story continues to captivate us precisely because it combines everything we find compelling about history: mystery, political intrigue, and the eternal struggle between power and innocence. What do you think happened to Edward V and Richard, Duke of York? Do you believe Richard III was guilty, or do you suspect someone else? Let me know in the comments below. I read every single one. If you enjoyed this dive into medieval mystery, make sure to subscribe to DarkAges Chronicles for more dark stories from history's shadows. Hit that notification bell so you never miss our latest investigation into the past's deepest secrets. Next week, we'll be exploring another medieval mystery. Until then, keep questioning the official story, because sometimes the truth is far darker than anyone wants to admit.